Welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast. I am not your host, Seth Gruber.
But I am so excited to have Seth with us today. And on this podcast, as you all know, it's our weekly dive into biblical worldview and applying the Lordship of Jesus into all of life. And I just want to say thanks for making the time to be with us on the podcast today. We've had a busy couple of days already.
Yeah.
I don't know when this is going to air, in the next couple of weeks, I guess, but we will have been at the Lake County Right to Life banquet where Seth was the speaker, did a phenomenal job. We had a couple hours of a deep dive this morning into the ideological history, I guess, of some really bad seed that has been planted that is producing horrific fruit right now in America and around the world. But back to Seth. Seth is the president of the White Rose Resistant, also a podcast every week called Unaborted.
That's right.
And again, a national leader in the whole pro-life movement. And we're just grateful that you're on the show with us today. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pastor Ron. Yeah, it's good to be with you, man.
You were talking about last night, ideas have consequences. And
bad ideas have victims.
And bad ideas have victims. We're seeing the victims. The body is literally strewn all around us in American culture today. Talk a little bit about where you took us, I guess, maybe last night. How do we get in such a place today where there's such moral blindness and so much damage going around? I mean, so many casualties, not only with the unborn, but just with the whole LGBT transgender movement, the mutilation of children. I mean, the list goes on and on. We don't even know what a man is, a woman is. You did such a great deep dive, and we're not going to get there in this podcast in the short time that we have, but talk about ideas and consequences and why you're doing, I guess, what you're doing today, because it's so important.
Well, I think, Pastor Ron, most of the issues we're facing come from a lack of moral teaching from the pulpit, actually. That's actually kind of my more fundamental premise.
Messing with the pulpit.
Yeah, because, as Reagan said, evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. And my organization is built off of the story of the White Rose Resistance in Nazi Germany, and a bunch of 20-somethings that were leading this anti-Nazi Christian resistance movement, and they were publicly criticizing the doers of evil because they understood that this is nothing new.
Yeah.
I mean, these were people who were grounded in the history of the world, in the history of the West, very rooted in a biblical worldview. We were talking earlier at dinner about, the power of the American mind in the 1850s with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I mean, most American citizens at that time had a fairly robust understanding of a lot of things that we can't even assume our congregants understand anymore. Things about political philosophy, human nature, history, different political attempts at different forms of government over the history of the world. That's now lost on most people. And so what we have to understand is that what we're living through is wicked and evil, but we only think it's so wicked and evil because we become so accustomed to American liberties and freedoms. Excuse me. We think that this is unprecedented in American, our political project. Yeah, in a way in our political project, but not in the history of the world.
Exactly.
Our form of government is so unique. It's insulated us from experiencing tyranny to the degree and frequency that most people who came before us did.
Right.
It's so incredibly unique. And so tyranny moves slower in America because of our form of government. So this totalitarian Marxist takeover of America that we're experiencing, that's been walking through the institutions for so long, that's been brewing under the surface for so long, the only reason it's taken so long is because of our form of government. If we weren't a constitutional republic, these utopian Marxist tyrants would have accomplished their political takeover decades ago, over 100 years ago. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. And we think that we're flying.
But you made a point about the pulpit to start with, and maybe because I'm a pastor, I'm gonna go back to there.
I'm getting there. So I'm actually I'm still answering the same question, brother. So because of the ignorance in the public, because of our weird belief that we think that we never lived through this before. What's going on? This is unprecedented, right? It's because of the ignorance about history and human nature and religion that would lead to saying something as foolish as that. Yeah. What we're living through is actually not all that unique. Now, transing the kid's a little bit more unique, but the ideologies behind that and the kooky religious precepts behind that are actually nothing new at all. And so if this fight is nothing new, if this type of evil is not only not new, but it's actually not as bad as what other cultures have done over the last 6,000 years, then what? Well, then we need to stop blaming the doers of evil. We need to stop thinking that like they're to blame and how could they do this? And we need to start looking in the mirror and saying, what hath my apathy wrought? Why have I not said anything? And to quote my friend and dear brother, Bill Federer, every king has a counselor, right? So who's the king in America? We the people, the sovereign. We're the king in America. So who's the counselor to we the people, the king in America? It was supposed to be the pulpits. And the pulpits have gone silent. They have for a long time. Now, we're going to talk about some good news. I think there's a stirring and a shaking and awakening happening. But the pulpits have gone silent for so long, and there's many reasons for that. But I go back to my answer. I think most of the issues our country is facing stem from a lack of moral teaching from the pulpit.
And you know, the pulpits in colonial America were the thought leaders. You know, you came to church to get educated, not just on how to have a personal relationship with the Lord or typical discipleship issues, but pastors were touching on all types of issues from the pulpit. From property taxes to tyranny, religious liberty, you know, the right to bear arms. I mean, all these things were first preached in the pulpit. And you brought up an important point in the White Rose Resistance, a gal by the name of Sophie. She had more courage and more insight and more prophetic understanding of her day than most of the pulpits in Germany at the time.
Than most pastors in America do as well. But certainly
and
than most pulpits in Germany. And way more courage. That's exactly right.
So I guess how do we get here, and what do we do to get out? You know, I've been trying to encourage pastors for most of my life to speak on these issues. Of course, we have a very narrow view of the gospel these days, and I think one of the things I've appreciated about my time with you so far and with our people is just a fresh challenge for the church to be involved, for courage to come back into our hearts, to realize the spiritual warfare that you're talking about is nothing new. This has been going on since the garden and since the fall.
That's right.
And to understand the spiritual dimensions behind it. But this really is a time for Christians to get involved and for the church to rise up.
That's right. And there will always be a battle. That's just part of what it means to be human. People want power. They want to be in control. They want to set the terms of engagement. I mean, like, we used to understand this about human nature and politics, that there would be a dominant morality. There would be a dominant compass or religion that reigns in the public square. And, you know, a lot of the lies of liberalism actually were that there could be this sort of apolitical space, that there could be kind of this new neutral space that we could all agree to leave the politics out of. That's right. And that's never been the case. It's one of the most rotten lies of liberalism and, frankly, of libertarianism as well. And I think people are starting to realize that, right? And so Alexander Solzhenitsyn has this powerful line, the survivor of the Russian gulags, who wrote the book The Gulag Archipelago. And he says, in keeping silent about evil and burying it so deep within us that no sign of it appears on the surface, we were implanting it. And it would then rise up 1,000-fold in the future. We have to understand that the culture war we've been in for so long, it was always a proxy war for a deeper spiritual war. There are layers of religious assumptions packed into the culture war. And so, as Cardinal Manning famously said, all human conflict is ultimately theological. So when we abdicate those spaces and we keep silent about evil, we bury it because we just want to preach the gospel. And we don't want our associations with a political party, their policies or president to harm our Christian witness. Because then the Democrats who are trying to lead to Jesus, they won't want to hear the gospel if they find out that I voted for Trump. We heard a lot of these kind of things.
The gospel of niceness.
That's right.
I always say people have the problem with trying to be more nice than Jesus. Of course, Jesus is the epitome of virtue, but somehow we think we can, you know, again, take that approach and that everybody's just going to come flocking to Jesus while we avoid the issues. Like you said, bury them and then reap 1,000, you know, evils in their stead from simply not addressing it.
And so let's look at some of the issues we're talking about today. We're talking about abortion, child sacrifice. We're talking about transgenderism, that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy, and gender and sex is malleable and subjective. And so biology and our physical nature doesn't provide any signals or rational basis for kind of understanding who people are.
Right.
We're talking about the removal of parental rights, which is what every communist degenerate always believed. Hitler would say things like, I don't care if you disagree with me, I have your children in my schools. You know, like this belief that the state owns children and that they're better situated.
Turning parents against their children against their parents.
Right, and that's a biblical thing too, right? Sister against mother, son against father, the whole thing. And this belief, though, that the state is better situated to educate children than the parents. The kooky pornographic sex ed in the schools, which is, I mean, you almost had a Tea Party level grassroots uprising happening of Mama Bears and Papa Bears speaking at school board meetings.
In Virginia, a complete flip-flop of
Loudoun County
leadership.
I was just with Pastor Gary Hamrick for the White Rose Tour. He's become a new friend, wonderful brother, and the man whose daughter was raped, one of the two daughters that was raped by this dude who said he was a girl and got into the girls' restrooms, that dad actually goes to Cornerstone Chapel now with Gary Hamrick and got saved, and his family goes to that church now.
What a cool story.
But like all these things we're talking about, right? We're talking about fundamentally spiritual issues now.
Right.
We're not merely talking about like, what exactly is the tax rate that's moral or immoral? Like we're talking about fundamental spiritual issues, right? And when I'm so sorry to ruin your podcast. I just got a tickle.
Great.
When pastors and Christians refuse to speak to those issues, right? Because they say, I'm not political. No, it's actually you're refusing to preach against false religion. That masquerades as just the politics to keep the politically impotent pastor silent. Because they don't want to harm their Christian witness. And so listen, when we talk about politics, and I know you know this, Pastor Ron, but for people listening, when we talk about politics, we're really talking about applied morality, aren't we? Because it's a constitutional republic, we all got to get together.
Common life together.
Exactly, we got to figure out how we're going to get together because we all share the space. So you're talking about applied morality. How do you apply moral principles to our form of government to dictate what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, what laws are on the books and what's allowed and what's not? But when you talk about applied morality, you're really talking about morality in general. Is there such a thing as objective truth?
Right.
Is it all subjective? Can man be God? Or is there a dominant actual moral standard that we're all beholden to? When you talk about morality, you're actually assuming certain things about epistemology, the study of knowledge,
How
right?
we know what we know.
Can we know things at all? Can we know that a man
and
from a
how do
woman?
we know?
Or are we going to be like the old Gnostics who say, well, there is an objective morality. It does exist, but we can't access it because we're trapped behind our sense perceptions, right? So when so listen, we're zooming out now, right? When you talk about politics, you're talking about applied morality. When you talk about applied morality, you're assuming certain things about morality in general. When you talk about morality, you're actually assuming certain things about epistemology, that you can actually know things about truth and false. When you talk about epistemology, you're actually assuming certain things about ontology and teleology. What's the purpose of man? Why are we here? Who made us? Right? What's the purpose of my body? What's the purpose of my mind? What's the purpose of my family? Why am I allowed to have kids in the first place? Right? Like this mic only fulfills its telos, its purpose, to the extent that it projects my docent tones to your listeners. Right? But when you talk about teleology and ontology, you're assuming certain things about theology. So we have to understand that packed within our cultural and political lives and debates are packed in layers of assumptions about these various forms of knowledge, these various ways to view the world, and ultimately assumptions about God and religion. Who made us? Where do we come from? Why are we here? And so you can't escape that.
Right.
That's why I just cited him. Cardinal Manning said all human conflict is ultimately theological. When you zoom out from these issues and debates, you end up back at the conversation of, is there a God? Who made us?
Right.
Where do we come from? What's our
the
purpose?
meaning of all this?
You can't avoid that. But most Americans and Christians, Pastor Ron, have not been discipled or educated or equipped to go that deep, to understand, when you talk about abortion, you're actually talking about morality. Like, is it wrong to kill innocent human beings, or can we do whatever the hell we want?
Right.
But when you talk about that, I guess what you're really talking about is, what does it mean to be human? Right? is there anything exceptional about humans that makes us maybe more significant than the cow and the dog? Right. When you talk about that, you start to say, well, then I guess what we're really talking about is what's the purpose of man? Do we have a reason why we're here, or are we just cosmic electrified sludge banging around in the universe so we can do whatever the hell we want? Yep. And look, but when you talk about that, I guess you can't really escape the question of like, if human beings do have dignity that's different from the cow, the dog, and the cat, then who gave us that dignity? Right. And how did we get here? You cannot avoid the fact that all human conflict is ultimately theological. So when we refuse to engage on these issues, not only are we apathetic, not only are we preaching a false gospel or refusing to preach against false religion, we're subtly informing our congregations that the gospel has nothing to say to those issues. Yeah. We're saying that I, as your pastor, I don't know how to tell you how to think about those issues. I'm not going to touch on them or preach on them. So you're silently communicating to your flock that Christianity is not big enough to handle your questions. Right. Questions on issues that most of our flocks, Ron, are very confused on and seeking clarity for. So what did you just do? And here's my last point. You sent them into the arms of the secular culture and the high priest of humanism to find answers to questions that you wouldn't apply the full counsel of God to. Yeah. That's why I said to your first question, most of the issues we're facing in America come from a lack of moral teaching from the pulpit.
Yeah. So, the problem being, I have found people... We think of the by and by, right? We think of eternal life and preparing people for eternal life. My dad used to say, if that was the end goal, we should just get you saved and then execute you so that you don't backslide.
That's right.
Between now and eternity.
Which means you should also love abortion, because then we know those babies go straight to heaven.
There you go.
They won't have a chance to fall back. Isn't that wonderful? I'm sure that's what God would want.
It's a warped understanding. But here's the deal, too. People forget that we have a life to live. So I talk to people, do you want to pay high taxes? Do you want the government stealing all of your money and redistributing your wealth? Do you want to have a great marriage? Do you want to be able to raise kids in a culture where they're not being consumed by perversion all around them? Do you want media, entertainment options and choices? Would you like, as Christians, for your children to have the same opportunities in the world that the secularists do? Because right now, if the word public is in front of things, you're going to be limited on your belief system, whether you're going to be able to be hired for that job. I mean, we have a life to live. And God wants us to take dominion on planet Earth and to create a culture that brings him glory and honor. Yep. And we're just talking about the sweet by and by, and you got a 16-year-old that's going, I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. So, what is my purpose in life? And why isn't my church providing me with the bigger picture? Yep. And so I couldn't agree with you more. Just challenging us to address the issues. It irks me. I'll call pastor and say, did you talk about such and such? This just happened. This is going to have a huge impact on religious liberty. Did anybody in your church talk about this?
And they don't even know about it.
No.
Yeah. Most of them don't even know what's going on.
Nope. Just business as usual. Yep. A head in the sand. And major liberties are being attacked. Yep. And again, so it's just a wake-up call to me. If you care about your kids and the future, and you're not going to be a politician and just kick the problem down the road, then we've got to get engaged. And so I know I've tried to do that. We try to preach series. We did a series called Me, M-E, and it was all about identity. Yeah. And about this transgender craziness and the bad ideas that led to the craziness that we're in today. And you touched on so much of that today. Let's get back in particular on the issue of life, because that's where you have dedicated your life and your calling. Yep. Talk a little bit about that unique beginning. I love how God shaped you for this call. And kind of just where you see things moving. Roe v. Wade, of course, that was a major win for us, being dismantled and shot down.
We were told that would never happen, right?
Exactly. Most people thought that will never happen in our lifetime. And yet here we are, but we know the battle hasn't ended. So maybe you could frame for our listeners, what does that look like, and what do we need to be doing right now?
Yeah. So my mother was the director of a pregnancy resource center in Los Angeles County while pregnant with me, and she stepped down after she gave birth to me. So she directed that center through all 9 months of pregnancy with me. So I've been a pro-life activist since I was a fetus. Yeah. So I say I've been sassy since conception.
You've been in all those counseling sessions and saving.
That's right. Well, because they told me my body, my choice. So they told me there was only one body involved. So if there's only one body involved, then there was no baby's body. It was always part of the mother's body, which means every baby my mother saved while directing a pregnancy resource center, I saved, because I guess there was only one body. And so follow the science, Pastor Ron. You science denier, Republican, rude, domestic terrorist, right? To quote Merrick Garland.
Don't forget the plural.
Deplorables and irredeemables. That's right. Or to quote Margaret Sanger, unfit to live. Right. Yeah, exactly. So we're just kind of living through the next iteration of eugenics, right?
Yeah.
Eugenics always, it morphs, it transitions, it transes itself, but it's always a new iteration, because eugenics, which is really just kind of the liturgy of humanism, there is no limiting principle to that political project. There never has been, because if you detach human dignity and the right to life from simply being human, then you can justify anything. If you can liberate ourselves even from the constraints of human nature itself, there's no end to your political project. And so, of course, they're calling us this. Of course, they're arresting pro-life sidewalk counselors. Of course, they're saying that pregnancy resource centers are the great dangerous spreaders of misinformation. Of course, Jane Fonda doesn't get any flack for saying that maybe we should murder pro-life politicians because of the threats to women's bodies that are coming since Roe v. Wade got overturned. These people are speaking the rhetoric of all of the eugenicists before them. They're walking in the same intellectual, political, and spiritual tradition of all the humanists who've gone before them that goes back hundreds of years. None of this is new, except they've got more cunning. Actually, they've gotten as wise as serpents, and certainly not innocent as doves, and they're just better at what they're doing. And so it lulls people into a silence, and it lulls people into apathy. And again, that's kind of why we're in the position we're in, because good people won't speak. So but then Roe v. Wade changes. I mean, wow. I mean, that's something, if you're under 40, we were told by our public schools, by our friends, by the culture, by the media, by Hollywood, that this would never get overturned, that this was settled law. Like, if anything was settled, it was a woman's right to get health care.
You talk about kicking the demonic hornet's nest. I mean, we saw the response of the left. I mean, they went off the hinge. As you said, that's their sacred right that they worship at the shrine.
Well, they were wearing this stupid Handmaid's Tale dress, which is that whole book is based off of the premise that the great threat to America is Christian nationalism. That's what the whole book and series is based off of. The Republicans want to take us back to when women are just used as sex slaves and have to pop out children for them. That's really what Mitch McConnell wants. It's like, good Lord. It's like the only threat to American liberties and freedom right now is the religion of secular humanism, secular globalism, not Christian nationalism. The very religion that built this country and gave you the freedoms to spout the crap that you spout in D.C. and on national television. Anyway, I'm getting a little carried away right now. But they were wearing these handmaid tale things, right, Pastor Ron? They were walking into churches in about the 30 days after the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Mostly Catholic churches, by the way. Which, by the way, let me say something. If Stephen Furtick and Andy Stanley and Tim Keller and Rick Warren and other mega pastors who apparently are such a blessing to the body of Christ didn't have anyone walking into their churches, what does that tell you? They don't see you as a threat. It was a really important lesson, Pastor Ron. The people that these humanists dressed up in Handmaid's Tale outfits, the churches they walked into were the ones they deemed as a threat, and they were mostly Catholic churches. Which should tell the Protestant church everything it needs to know. We have abdicated this battle. Our Catholic friends have done better protecting the preborn than we have.
They've been at it a lot longer.
That's right. So much so that most of these people don't view Protestant churches as that much of a threat. Now, obviously, we know we are, and we know we can be. But I'm saying, isn't it interesting what they think? And they were walking in and disrupting churches on Saturdays and Sundays, Ron. You know what they were chanting? Without this basic right, women can't be free. Abortion on demand and without apology. Without this basic right, women can't be free. That has always been the fundamental belief. That unless you have the right to kill your own baby, you are not free. Sounds like Margaret Sanger. No gods and no masters. I'm my own God. Freedom is indulging any sexual appetite I have. And then, oops, oh, well, I didn't want a baby, so I consented to sex, but I didn't consent to pregnancy. So child sacrifice becomes the conclusion of the sexual revolution.
It's the end of the conveyor belt, isn't it?
That's right. It's a good way to say it.
We launched the whole sexual revolution, free sex, whatever, but then when the consequences come, we don't want to live with the baby.
That's right. I've always said that ultimately being pro-choice is the belief that you have the right to orgasms without responsibility. You should be able to indulge and feel good without adopting any responsibility for your sexual choices. That's ultimately what we're dealing with. And so it was fascinating to watch the liberal establishment collapse in on itself like a dying star and start manifesting their inner transgender legions, screaming and roaring for blood and apologizing to Moloch. I'm sorry, Baal, we failed you, Moloch.
We saw some of those Twitter feeds with those on the left just screaming, like demonic screaming.
Because it is demonic. It is demonic. It's not ironic. It's not funny. It's real. Demons are real, spiritual warfare is real, and Satan has always been behind the killing of babies. It's his pride and joy.
You know, you hit on that in such a great way this morning, but the agenda has always been the devil hates human beings created in the image and likeness of God.
Hates the family.
When he looks at you, he sees your father, and he hates your guts.
That's right.
And so everything he does, it's all on that simple.
It's really just as simple as that.
Evil. I'm going to destroy as many human beings as I can in as many ways as I can. And like you say, the battle plan is not new, but it is more creative now due to technology and some of the other things that we have in our culture.
And by the way, the people behind all this, Ron, the people we've been facing for so long, they call themselves religious. Now, they don't as much anymore, but they used to. It's very interesting.
They're spiritual, too.
In 1954, we get the Johnson Amendment. This lie that there's a separation between church and state. And that was used to get the Bible out of schools, prayer out of schools, worship, the whole thing, right? Because we can't have religious spheres. It all has to be religiously neutral. Because our founders, don't you know, Ron, they were all deists. They didn't
which we know is not true.
Which, of course, you know is not true. But so in 1954, we get the Johnson Amendment. Within 4 years, the American Humanist Association, the American Humanist Association, 1958, drafts this action plan. And the action plan was to mobilize their humanists to go out and search and find instances where the Bible was being read in schools, or where prayer was happening in schools, or where teachers were talking about Christianity. They literally created this action task list. I've looked at it to say, go and find examples of where this is happening and challenge its constitutionality.
Wow.
So they were doing this within 4 years of the Johnson Amendment, relentlessly pursuing their religious agenda. Now, you go all the way back to the American Humanist Association's founding, which I think was like 1942, but you'll have to, don't hold me to that, you'll have to fact check me on that. It might have been 41, 42. And their Articles of Incorporation say that they exist for religious reasons. They saw this as a religion. And so for pastors and Christians to not engage on these issues when the modern disciples of those sexual revolutionary people are saying, oh, yeah, no, this is totally religious. I mean, of course it's religious.
And the public schools have become the new battleground
of course.
For our kids. I mean, and as you said, there's no neutrality about it. You know, for years, I think because of our Christian inklings, Christian character, tolerance, love, you know, there was always, who are you guys to shove your religious views down our throat, right? And we're like, oh, good point. Everybody's not a Christian. Maybe there's a shred of truth to that. And then you realize they are absolutely shoving their views down our throats, making us feel guilty when we actually stand with our convictions.
That's right. We call it the intolerance of tolerance.
Yes, and there is no neutral ground, as you said. And the sooner we figure that out, the more we realize. And I think it was a quote you shared from Bonhoeffer. You're gonna have to share it. But it was with the.
If I sit next to a madman as he drives a car into a group of innocent bystanders, I can, as a Christian, simply wait for the catastrophe to happen, then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver. To quote Bonhoeffer again, the question for a responsible man to ask is not how he is to extricate himself heroically from the affair, but how the coming generation shall continue to live. All of those things require politics.
Absolutely. You know, that first quote from Bonhoeffer, to me, is where we're at as a culture today, especially the evangelical church.
Oh, yeah.
We just want to wait. As people come, our arms are wide open. We're going to be here to try to put the pieces back together from the devastation that's happening with your kids being mutilated.
And where did that devastation come from?
Yeah, it came from
upstream.
My passivity.
It came from upstream, from ideologies, ideas, and policies. But we weren't upstream. To quote my pastor, Rob McCoy, the church waits downstream to pick up human heartache that they helped create through their political
the crazy man
upstream.
behind the wheel. We're hugging him and loving him and being,
Jesus loves you, Jesus
tolerant.
loves you, yeah.
And
meanwhile,
while he drives over the cliff and kills a bunch of people.
Children are running under that bus. Families are being decimated. Kids are having their genitalia chopped off. Babies are being murdered. And we're saying, Jesus loves you, and he just continues to drive the bus over everyone. And then we say that we're so loving. We're so loving that we don't engage in the dirty business of politics. So much so that John Piper, of all people,
I was incredibly disappointed.
Writes a horrific article in 2020, 6 weeks or so before the election. Pastor Rob McCoy and I did a whole treatment of it on one of his podcasts because we were so scandalized by it. And if I were to summarize that article, it would be something like this. So one guy's really meany because he's prideful and he tweets really mean things and he treats women
slightly narcissistic.
He treats women really bad. He's a big meanie and so he has the sin of pride. And pride ultimately leads to death because sin leads to death and pride is sin. And so one guy, he's really prideful. This guy, he murders the babies. That's child sacrifice and that's wrong. And abortion leads to death because the baby's dead. So abortion leads to death, but pride leads to death because all sin leads to death. So really, I can't discriminate or really exercise discretion between my two options, because either way, I would be encouraging the church in America to choose the path that leads to death, and they both do. And so who am I to figure out the righteous Christian choice to make at the ballot?
Yeah.
That was basically the premise of John Piper's article. It was utterly disgusting. He was conflating the personal sins of a president with the national sin of murdering babies.
Right.
He conflated those and said basically he, as John Piper, is not smart enough to figure out the difference between the personal sin of pride in your heart and the national sin of murdering 1 million babies a year and 65 million babies since 1973. Apparently, that was too much of a doozy for John Piper. He couldn't figure that one out.
Yeah.
And so I believe the title of the article, Ron, or the subtitle was the subtitle or the caption on social media when he shared it was, "This is the closest answer you'll get from me as to who I'm voting for."
Yeah.
But he didn't actually say who he was voting for. But when you walk away from the article, you come away with two options.
Yeah.
Either John Piper was saying don't vote.
Right.
Or he was saying vote for Biden. It was one of those. It was certainly not Trump.
Right.
I mean, what a despicable thing to say from such a man who's done so much wonderful good
and
for
again,
the church.
You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that was, when it comes to theology of public engagement, let's just say it's found wanting, and it is in so many arenas. I like to tell our people there's a holy trinity of public engagement. And you hit on this. The first principle is the principle of life. If they get life wrong, they'll get everything else wrong.
Yeah.
If you can't trust a politician with your life, you can't trust them with your pocketbook, your taxes, your kids, or anything else. The second one is marriage, because if you can't figure out the cornerstone of foundation of society, biblical marriage, and that family unit, then you're really messed up as well. And the third one is religious liberty. Like, if I can't say what I believe and bring Jesus in the public arena, whether it's public school, the marketplace, politics, if I can't bring my faith, then I have no freedom. And those three, to me, are non-negotiable. And fortunately, at least in America, American politics on the federal level, we have not been confronted with the lesser of two evil kind of approach. Because at least in the last election cycle, Donald Trump was strongly pro-life in his policy. He was looking at striking down the Johnson Amendment and worked hard to protect religious liberty. And the third area, he was not for gay marriage and trying to promote gay marriage. He had an understanding of at least the family unit. I don't know where all that's happened now, but at least we had a choice. Of course, Biden was wrong on all three accounts.
That's right.
And so I have no problem standing in the pulpit. My approach has always been not to tell people who to vote for, but I tell people who not to vote for, who they cannot vote for. And then since there's only two candidates, and they kind of figure out, they can figure it out for themselves.
How did you say it about Obama?
Oh yeah, so back in the day, right, it was Obama and McCain. So all you got to do is look at the platform.
Yeah.
There was no surprise. And so I simply made the non-controversial statement that a vote for then Senator Barack Obama would be a sign of severe moral schizophrenia for a believer. Like, you cannot vote for this man based upon what his platform was. And of course, he was the great divider. I don't think there's been anybody that has more racially divided Americans than Barack Obama. And he had the opportunity. The majority of Americans voted him into office. And yet, as soon as we're in office, we deal with everybody's racist and separate and divide, which, of course, is the whole Marxist plan anyway.
Yeah, that's right. To pit people against one another.
That's right. Make us all, create chaos everywhere. And anyway, so, but again, that's the truth. I mean, we have to stop voting for wicked people.
How did Rushduni put it? Moral chaos is always the prelude to statist tyranny. This vaunted freedom from law ends always in a freedom from liberty.
Yes.
Moral chaos is always the prelude to
moral chaos
tyranny.
And cultural chaos, and then everybody's freaking out. Most people just want everything to be peaceful, no matter what the cost. And so now you have tyranny.
So the government comes a tyrant who says, "Give me some emergency powers temporarily to solve these problems." But then we never get those emergency powers back.
That was my biggest argument during COVID. Just a side note here.
Nobody does that better than Bill Federer, by the way.
Oh, he
does a whole history on how that's always been the playbook of revolutionaries. Is to cause the disease, and then come with the antidote. But saying the prerequisite for the antidote is I need a bunch of power to solve the disease that I caused.
That we created behind the scenes.
And then you never get those powers back. And Bill Federer does that from like Plato to present.
So quick book recommendation here. Bill Federer's book called Socialism, a must read. Encourage you to pick up a copy
Plato
of that.
To present,
yeah, absolutely. Back to that situation though. On where were we at? Help me out.
Chaos.
Solution, okay. So
tyrants.
The biggest thing with COVID for me was, we have unelected bureaucrats making
Fauci,
policy.
Collins,
Local health departments telling us what we can and can't do. We had our governor telling us whether we could take communion or not take communion, whether we could sing, could not sing because of water droplets. And we've got all of these groups of people weighing in. While there's such hypocrisy, of course, in your state we had drug marijuana dispensaries, we had abortion clinics, we had strip clubs open.
That's right. You could kill your baby, get a lap dance while high. And those were essential services. If you met in your church at 50% capacity to worship the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who entered human history into uterus to redeem mankind from their sins, you were a granny killer and a super spreader. And Gavin Newsom-Leaney had an executive order saying no singing in churches. But then when the high priest of humanism and the deacons in the Church of Progressivism hit the streets of LA, San Francisco, and Berkeley and said, "America sucks, burn it down. Black Lives Matter. George Floyd." He came out and said, "Thank you for bringing an awareness to the public health crisis of systemic racism." So we learned that COVID got woke. It only infected religious conservatives and not secular liberals. Then we all went, okay, this is all BS.
Absolutely.
But look, to prove your point, right?
Right.
They come in, they cause the problem, and then they say, give us a ton of powers. But it's always only ever used to advance their own power and their own agenda.
Wrap it up here. This is Seth Gruber, who I so appreciate him being with me. Appreciate his message. We're going to attach the notes to we had about a two and a half hour session with you this afternoon that was pure wine, pure gold. It was incredible. We will attach the link to those notes at the bottom of this podcast. But I encourage you, go to his website. Check out the ministry. Check out the
yes. Thank you.
Unaborted.
You can go to sethgruber.com for my speaking schedule, learn more, or our organization's website. It's thewhiterose.life, www.thewhiterose.life. And we're looking for people to join us at just $35 a month. You get equipped with a live call every month. You get free merch, and you get trained and equipped to be a voice for the unborn in this culture of death. And we're building a team to mobilize and lead the church into action and public engagement to be like Gideon. Yeah,
you're building an army so we don't lose our feeling altogether by simply sitting on the sidelines feeling bad about things.
That's
so
right.
I appreciate you, appreciate your vision, and thank you so much for being with me
Bless
today.
You.
And hey, until next Thursday, have an amazing week. Check out the website, websites that Seth just mentioned and get involved. Here at Living Stones, obviously, too, we're looking to mobilize and build up an army of God-loving, Jesus-loving, life-loving activists as well. So we'd love to have you join us. And again, until next week, we'll look forward to spending some time with you here on the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast. Have a great week.